Julius Malema, the leader of South Africa's economic freedom fighters, is making serious accusations against Rwanda and its president, Paul Kagame. He claims that Rwanda is secretly working against South African troops deployed in the Democratic Republic of Congo and that President Cyril Ramaphosa's government is not doing enough to protect the soldiers. Chapter 1. Accusations against Rwanda and President Kagame. Julius Malema directly accuses Rwandan President Paul Kagame of being responsible for the troubles South African soldiers are facing in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. He believes that Rwanda has been secretly supporting the M23 rebel group, which has made it difficult for South African troops to carry out their peacekeeping mission. Malema claims that because of Kagame's backing, these rebels have become more confident and now openly challenge South African forces. Malema also questions why Rwanda is still considered an ally when it is allegedly working against South Africa. He points to Rwanda's past deals, such as its agreement with the United Kingdom to accept migrants in exchange for money. He sees this as proof that Kagame's government is aligned with Western powers rather than focusing on African unity. Furthermore, Malema suggests that Kagame is not just acting for Rwanda's benefit, but is part of a bigger plan to keep the DRC unstable. He believes that Western countries, especially France, protect Kagame, allowing him to act without consequences while South African soldiers suffer. If Malema's claims are true, it would mean that South Africa's government has been too trusting in its partnerships and needs to rethink its role in the region. Chapter 2. South African soldiers in crisis. Beyond the political implications, Malema's speech sheds light on the dire conditions faced by South African troops stationed in the DRC. According to him, the government is withholding critical information about the true state of affairs, particularly regarding captured soldiers. He alleges that some troops have been taken hostage by the M23 rebels, and yet there has been no official confirmation or rescue plan announced. The humiliation doesn't end there. Malema describes how South African soldiers stationed at a military base near Goma Airport are essentially powerless, despite being armed. He claims that they must seek permission from M23 rebels for even the most basic needs, including access to sanitation facilities. The situation, as he describes it, is one of utter embarrassment. South Africa's military presence in the DRC is no longer a show of strength but an example of vulnerability. Malema takes particular issue with the government's decision to continue sending troops abroad when South Africa's own military is underfunded and struggling. He argues that the state should focus on strengthening its own defenses before engaging in foreign conflicts. To him, the current deployment strategy is reckless and endangers soldiers who are not given the necessary support to succeed. Chapter 3. Criticism of the South African military leadership. Malema's criticism extends beyond Rwanda and Kagame. He also takes direct aim at South Africa's own military leadership. He portrays the country's armed forces as outdated, poorly managed, and incapable of responding to modern military challenges. One of his most damning claims is that South Africa currently lacks operational fighter jets, meaning that its air force is effectively paralyzed. According to Malema, the government is deliberately hiding these military failures from the public to protect its own reputation. He argues that instead of acknowledging the army's weaknesses and working on solutions, the leadership continues to send troops into dangerous situations with little preparation. His solution is a complete military overhaul, one that includes withdrawing soldiers from the DRC, regrouping them, and retraining them for future engagements. His anger is particularly evident when discussing how Kagame allegedly spoke to President Cyril Ramaphosa. Malema makes it clear that he sees Kagame's approach as disrespectful and unacceptable. He warns that no foreign leader should ever be allowed to dictate terms to South Africa, and he demands that Ramaphosa assert the country's sovereignty with strength. Chapter 4. Condemnation of Kagame and Rwanda's role in the DRC crisis. In Malema's view, the crisis in the DRC is not just a regional issue, it is part of a larger struggle between African self-determination and foreign interference. He argues that Rwanda, with the backing of France and other Western powers, is actively challenging South Africa's influence on the continent. This, he claims, is why Rwanda feels emboldened to support groups like M23, even when it leads to direct confrontations with South African soldiers. His stance is clear: Rwanda's involvement in the DRC crisis must be condemned, and South Africa should not hesitate to take action. He believes that the first step is to acknowledge the reality of the situation, including the losses suffered by South African troops. He calls for the immediate retrieval of fallen soldiers' bodies, arguing that they deserve dignity in death, even if the government failed them in life. Chapter 5. Critique of government's response to the crisis. One of Malema's most scathing attacks is directed at the South African government's response, or lack thereof, to the ongoing crisis. He ridicules the fact that while soldiers are struggling and dying in the DRC, the government has chosen to proceed with a military parade during the State of the Nation address. To him, this is a disgraceful attempt to distract from the reality of South Africa's declining military capabilities. He calls on Parliament to boycott the event, arguing that no one should participate in such a display while soldiers are being mistreated abroad. Until the government acknowledges and addresses the military's failures, there is no justification for such parades. Malema demands that before any further discussions on South Africa's military role in the DRC, the government must retrieve the bodies of fallen soldiers and ensure their proper burial. He sees this as a matter of basic respect and dignity, something he believes has been sorely lacking in the government's handling of the crisis. As he continues his attack, Malema also warns that South Africa must reclaim its position in continental politics. He believes that this can only happen through strategic military reforms and a reassessment of the country's alliances. He insists that South Africa should never again find itself in a situation where its soldiers are humiliated and disrespected on foreign soil. Chapter 6. Demands for action against Rwanda. Malema does not stop at criticizing South Africa's role in the DRC. He takes his attack further by demanding strong action against Rwanda. If it is proven that President Paul Kagame's government has actively targeted South African troops or played a role in supporting the M23 rebels, Malema insists that President Cyril Ramaphosa must act decisively. For him, this is not just a matter of foreign policy, it is a test of South Africa's sovereignty and strength as a nation. He calls for the severance of all diplomatic and trade relations with Rwanda, arguing that no country should be allowed to undermine South Africa's military and still be treated as a friend. As part of this demand, he urges the immediate closure of the Rwandan embassy in South Africa, sending a clear message that such betrayals will not be tolerated. At the same time, Malema warns that South Africa's reluctance to engage in war should not be mistaken for cowardice. He makes it clear that while the country is committed to peace and diplomacy, it will not hesitate to defend itself if necessary. If Rwanda continues to pose a threat to South African troops or interests, Malema insists that the country has every right to respond with strength. He challenges Ramaphosa to step up and prove that South Africa is not a weak state that can be manipulated by foreign powers. Do you know which foreign power he mentioned? Keep guessing. Chapter 7. United States sanctions and Donald Trump's threats against South Africa. Shifting his focus to global politics, Malema also takes aim at the United States, particularly current President Donald Trump. He condemns Trump's threats to cut foreign aid and impose sanctions on South Africa, calling them an act of economic bullying. According to Malema, these threats have nothing to do with national security or democracy. Instead, they are a direct response to South Africa's land expropriation policy, which seeks to return land to its rightful black owners without compensation. For Malema, Trump's opposition to land reform is proof of the deep-rooted imperialist mindset that still exists in Western countries. He argues that South Africa cannot allow itself to be intimidated by such threats and must move forward with land expropriation without compensation. He warns that relying on Western foreign aid only keeps South Africa economically dependent and vulnerable to manipulation. As an alternative, Malema pushes for stronger economic ties with China, Russia, and other BRICS nations. He believes that these partnerships can help South Africa achieve true economic independence, allowing it to chart its own course without interference from Western powers. He insists that South Africa should not allow the United States to dictate its policies or hold the country hostage with economic threats. Instead, he urges the government to strengthen its alliances with countries that respect its sovereignty and long-term development goals. Chapter 8. Support for Palestine and Condemnation of Israel. Malema then shifts to another major global issue, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. He welcomes the recent ceasefire in Gaza, but insists that it is not enough. According to Malema, Israel must be held accountable for the thousands of Palestinian lives lost during its military operations. He goes as far as calling Israel's actions a genocide, placing direct blame on Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The EFF leader strongly supports the International Criminal Court's arrest warrant against Netanyahu, arguing that he should be treated as a war criminal. For Malema, Israel's repeated attacks on Gaza are crimes against humanity, and the global community must take a stand. He calls on South Africa to go beyond mere condemnation and take concrete action by expelling the Israeli embassy and cutting all diplomatic ties with Israel. Malema's stance on Palestine is nothing new. He has long been a vocal critic of Israel's policies. However, in this speech, he intensifies his demands, making it clear that the EFF will not tolerate South Africa's continued diplomatic relationship with a country he views as an aggressor. He urges the government to take a principled stand, even if it means facing backlash from Western allies. Chapter 9. EFF's Governance Achievements. Shifting back to domestic issues. Malema takes the opportunity to highlight the EFF's governance achievements, particularly in Tshwane. He argues that since the Democratic Alliance was removed from power in 2024, the EFF has made significant progress in improving the lives of Black South Africans who were neglected under DA rule. He points to the restoration of clean drinking water in Hammanskraal as one of the party's major successes. Under the DA, Malema claims, this crisis was ignored, leaving thousands of residents without access to safe water. The EFF, he argues, has proven that real leadership can bring change beyond Tshwane. Malema also showcases the party's achievements in Johannesburg and Nelson Mandela Bay. He states that public safety and service delivery in Johannesburg have improved under EFF leadership, while in Nelson Mandela Bay, debt relief has been provided for old-age homes, and infrastructure has seen significant upgrades. These successes, according to Malema, prove that the DA's governance was ineffective and that the EFF is the true party of the people. Chapter 10. EFF's Roadmap to 2026 Elections. Looking ahead to the 2026 local government elections, Malema declares that it will be the year of the picket lines. He calls on EFF members to remain disciplined and focused, emphasizing that the party's goal is not just to win elections, but to transform South Africa's political and economic landscape. He promises that the EFF will continue to uplift the poor and fight for economic justice. Land expropriation, economic independence, and service delivery remain at the core of the party's strategy. Malema urges supporters to remain united and committed, assuring them that the EFF is on the path to securing a decisive victory. Malema's fiery visions leave no room for doubt. He is demanding action, both from South Africa's government and from its people. His accusations against Rwanda have escalated tensions in the DRC conflict, and his call for a withdrawal of South African troops raises serious questions about the country's military strategy. Beyond the battlefield, Malema's rejection of United States interference, his strong pro-Palestine stance, and his vision for South Africa's future paint a picture of a leader determined to reshape the nation's role on the global stage. With the 2026 elections approaching, one thing is sure, the EFF is gearing up for a major political battle, and Malema is not backing down. Let's wait and see what happens next.